The 42nd floor conference room glowed in the evening light as Celeste Hawthorne studied her chessboard alone. The soft knock interrupted her concentration. "Come in," she called without looking up. A tall janitor in coveralls entered, pushing his cleaning cart quietly. Something about the chess position caught his attention, and she noticed him watching. On impulse, driven by loneliness or arrogance, she smirked and made an offer that would change everything. "Beat me in chess, and I'll marry you." The man stopped, looked directly at her with serious gray-green eyes, and replied, "My name is Liam, and I play for real." Celeste Hawthorne had ruled her corner of the business world for over a decade, building her father's modest consulting firm into a multinational powerhouse through sheer force of will and an intellect that cut through boardroom politics like a blade. At 35, she had everything she'd ever wanted: respect, success, and enough money to buy anything except the one thing that had always eluded her. Love had proven to be a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when every relationship crumbled under the weight of her ambition or dissolved in the acid of others' jealousy over her success. Men either wanted to conquer her or be conquered by her, and she'd grown tired of both games long ago. The chess set before her was a relic from her father, carved from ebony and ivory, each piece a small work of art. She'd learned the game at his knee, back when his approval still mattered, before cancer took him and left her alone with an empire she'd never asked for but couldn't bear to lose. Now chess was her meditation, her escape from the endless demands of leadership. In the 64 squares of the board, she found a purity that the corporate world lacked. Every move had consequences, every decision mattered, and victory belonged to those who thought furthest ahead. Liam Carter existed in a different universe entirely. One measured not in quarterly profits, but in small victories and daily survival. At 39, he moved through the gleaming towers of downtown with the invisible efficiency of the working class, his presence noted only when something went wrong. His broad shoulders carried more than just the weight of industrial cleaning equipment. They bore the hopes and fears of a man who'd sacrificed everything for his daughter's future. The chess world knew him once as a prodigy, a teenager who danced across tournament boards with the grace of a poet and the killer instinct of a predator. But that was before Sarah died, before 8-year-old Emma's asthma attacks began stealing her breath in the middle of the night, before the medical bills and the sleepless vigils, and the realization that genius meant nothing if you couldn't protect the people you loved. Now he cleaned offices for $12 an hour plus benefits, the kind of steady work that came with health insurance and predictable schedules. His former life felt like a dream he'd once had, beautiful and distant, and utterly irrelevant to the man he'd become. Emma Carter was the brightest star in her father's reduced universe, a precocious 8-year-old with her mother's gentle spirit and her father's quick mind. Her asthma had been manageable until recently, but the attacks were growing more frequent, more severe, each one a reminder of how fragile their carefully constructed life really was. She didn't remember much about her mother, but she remembered the chess set that still sat on their kitchen table. The one her father would stare at sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his fingers tracing the pieces like old friends he'd lost touch with. The apartment they shared was modest but clean, filled with Emma's artwork and the quiet desperation of a single parent trying to make everything seem normal when nothing felt secure. The conference room seemed to shrink around them as Liam approached the chess table with measured steps. Celeste had expected him to laugh, to make some self-deprecating comment about not knowing how the pieces moved, to restore the natural order of their respective worlds. Instead, he was studying the board with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining an X-ray, his large hands hovering over the pieces with surprising delicacy. "You're playing the Queen's Gambit," he observed, settling into the chair across from her with an ease that suggested he belonged there. "Declined. Classical variation. You favor control over tactical complications." It wasn't a question, and the accuracy of his assessment made something flutter in Celeste's chest, surprise, perhaps, or the first stirring of genuine interest she'd felt in years. "You seem to know your way around a board," she replied, trying to maintain her casual tone while reassessing the man across from her. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as if he was used to being underestimated. "Are you sure you want to take me up on this?" "I don't lose often." Liam smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Neither do I," he said simply, reaching for the white queen's pawn. "Shall we reset the board?" What followed was the most intense chess game of Celeste's life. Liam played with a fluid grace that spoke of years of serious study, each move flowing naturally from the last, as if he were reading from a script only he could see. His opening was classical, but creative, establishing control of the center while keeping his real intentions hidden. Celeste found herself leaning forward, her usual confidence evaporating as she realized she was facing a player of genuine skill. By the 10th move, she knew she was in trouble. By the 15th, she was fighting for her life on the board. Liam's pieces moved with surgical precision, each capture and advance part of a larger pattern that was only now becoming clear. He wasn't just playing chess, he was conducting a symphony of strategy that built toward an inevitable crescendo. "Check," Liam said softly, his knight finding a square that seemed to appear from nowhere. Celeste stared at the board, her mind racing through possible defenses, each one crumbling under analysis. She moved her king to safety, but even as she did, she could see the walls closing in around her. "Check," he said again. A different piece this time, the attack coming from an angle she hadn't anticipated. Her palms were actually sweating now, something that hadn't happened since her first major presentation to the board of directors 15 years ago. The third check came like a thunderclap. "Checkmate," Liam announced, though his tone held no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction. The position was elegant in its brutality, her king trapped in a web of his pieces. No escape possible, the game over in exactly 21 moves. The board seemed to mock her as she stared at the final position, every piece a testament to her complete and utter defeat. Celeste Hawthorne, who had built an empire through careful calculation and strategic thinking, had been outmaneuvered by a man whose existence she'd barely acknowledged 5 minutes earlier. The Ivory King lay on its side where she'd tipped it in surrender, and somehow that small gesture felt like the most honest thing she'd done in years. "You hustled me," she said finally, her voice carrying a brittleness she didn't recognize. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, tinged with an anger that was directed more at herself than at him. "You let me think you were just some random guy who happened to know how the pieces moved." Liam began resetting the board with careful, practiced movements, each piece finding its starting square with the precision of a ritual. "I never said I was just some random guy," he replied evenly. "You assumed that, because of what I do for work, there's a difference." The distinction hit her like a slap, forcing her to confront the casual arrogance that had led her to this moment. She'd looked at his coveralls and his cleaning cart and reduced him to a stereotype, never imagining that intelligence might exist outside the narrow confines of her corporate world. The realization was uncomfortable, like discovering a blind spot in her peripheral vision that had been there all along. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, genuine curiosity overriding her wounded pride. "That wasn't luck or beginner's fortune. You dismantled me systematically." Liam finished placing the last pawn and looked up at her with those unsettling gray-green eyes. "I had some good teachers when I was younger," he said, and she caught something in his tone that suggested a story with depths she couldn't fathom. "Chess was my life once, before other things became more important." The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made her want to ask a dozen follow-up questions. But before she could form the words, Liam was rising from his chair, pushing the cleaning cart toward the door with the same quiet efficiency that had brought him into her orbit. "Thank you for the game, Miss Hawthorne," he said formally. "I should finish my rounds." Celeste watched him leave, her mind churning with questions she didn't know how to ask. The conference room felt different now, smaller somehow, as if his presence had expanded the space and his absence left it diminished. She looked down at the reset board, the pieces arranged in their eternal starting positions, and felt an unfamiliar hollow sensation in her chest. For the rest of the week, she found herself thinking about the quiet janitor who had humiliated her so thoroughly and so gracefully. It was her assistant's offhand comment about needing to update the building's service contractor database that gave her the excuse she needed. Employee background checks were a routine part of corporate security, she told herself, even as she pulled up Liam Carter's file on her computer late one Thursday evening. What she found there made her lean back in her chair as if she'd been physically struck. The basic information was unremarkable: 39 years old, widowed, one dependent child, clean driving record, no criminal history. But buried in the employment history section was a single line that changed everything. Previous occupation: professional chess player. USCF rating 2,437. Her hands trembled as she cross-referenced that rating with the official Chess Federation databases. The numbers told a story that left her breathless with disbelief and something approaching awe. Liam Carter hadn't just been a professional chess player. He'd been a genuine prodigy, a teenager who dominated the national junior circuits in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Tournament reports from 20 years ago described him as brilliant and fearless, a tactical genius with an intuitive understanding of complex positions. The deeper she dug, the more remarkable his story became. International master at 16, barely missing his grandmaster norms due to a family tragedy that had pulled him away from competitive play just as he was reaching his peak. There were forum posts from chess enthusiasts wondering whatever happened to that Carter kid who could have been the next Fischer. Speculation about a promising career cut short by mysterious circumstances. The mystery was solved in a death certificate she found through public records. Sarah Elizabeth Carter, age 29. Breast cancer, survived by husband Liam and daughter Emma. The date was 7 years ago, which meant he'd been caring for a terminally ill wife and a toddler when he'd walked away from professional chess forever. The sacrifice was staggering in its completeness. He'd given up not just a career, but an entire identity, transforming himself from a rising star into a custodian for the sake of his family's survival. Celeste found herself staring at tournament photographs from his glory days, studying the intense young man with the fierce eyes and the confident smile. That version of Liam Carter had inhabited a world of international travel and corporate sponsorships, magazine interviews, and appearance fees that could have set him up for life. He'd traded all of it for health insurance and a steady paycheck, becoming invisible so his daughter could breathe. The weight of her earlier dismissiveness settled on her like a physical burden. She'd looked at his work clothes and his quiet demeanor and assumed he was intellectually beneath her, never imagining that he'd sacrificed more than she'd ever achieved. The man who'd beaten her so effortlessly had been playing chess at the highest levels when she was still learning to read corporate balance sheets. More than that, he'd given up greatness for love. Something she'd never understood, because she'd never loved anyone more than she loved success. The next morning found her distracted and restless, unable to focus on the stream of meetings and decisions that normally consumed her attention. She'd planned to seek him out directly, to apologize for her assumptions and perhaps challenge him to another game. But fate intervened in the form of a medical emergency that would strip away the last of her pretenses. She was leaving the building around 6 in the evening when she heard the commotion in the parking garage. A man's voice, tight with panic, talking rapidly to what sounded like an emergency dispatcher. Following the sound, she found Liam kneeling beside a small girl who was struggling to breathe, her lips tinged with blue, her eyes wide with the particular terror of someone drowning in air. "Emma, baby, just try to relax," Liam was saying, his voice steady, despite the fear radiating from every line of his body. "The ambulance is coming, okay? Daddy's right here." In his hand was an inhaler that clearly wasn't providing enough relief, and Celeste could see the desperation in his movements as he tried to position his daughter to ease her breathing. Without thinking, Celeste dropped her briefcase and pulled out her phone. "This is Celeste Hawthorne," she said to the emergency operator in the voice that had commanded boardrooms for 15 years. "I need an ambulance at the Hawthorne Building parking garage immediately. We have a child in severe respiratory distress, and I'm authorizing the use of my company's helipad for emergency medical transport if necessary." The next hour passed in a blur of paramedics and oxygen tanks, of Liam's white face as he climbed into the ambulance beside his daughter's stretcher, of Celeste following in her own car, because somehow leaving felt impossible. At the hospital, she found herself in the uncomfortable position of being simultaneously essential and utterly useless. Her insurance information and emergency authorizations smoothed Emma's path through triage, but she could only watch helplessly as Liam disappeared behind the doors of the pediatric emergency department. She waited in the family lounge, surrounded by the particular mixture of hope and despair that hospitals cultivated, checking her phone every few minutes for updates she knew wouldn't come. When Liam finally emerged 3 hours later, his face was drawn with exhaustion but no longer shadowed by panic. "Emma was stable," he reported, responding well to the nebulizer treatments, likely to be discharged in the morning if her oxygen levels remained steady. "Thank you," he said simply. And she could see in his eyes that he understood exactly what her intervention had meant. They spent the next week finding excuses to encounter each other, casual meetings that felt anything but accidental. Celeste began taking coffee breaks in the building's lobby during Liam's afternoon shift, ostensibly reviewing reports but really hoping to catch glimpses of him as he worked. He, in turn, seemed to find reasons to clean the executive floors more frequently. Their conversations developing the easy rhythm of two people discovering they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The change in Celeste was subtle but profound, noticed first by her assistant and then by the senior partners who'd grown accustomed to her Arctic professional demeanor. She smiled more, laughed occasionally at meetings, seemed somehow more present in conversations instead of calculating 3 moves ahead. The transformation was attractive in ways that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with the emergence of a warmth that had been buried under years of corporate armor. For Liam, the friendship represented a different kind of revelation. He'd grown so accustomed to being invisible, to having his intelligence and his history dismissed or ignored, that Celeste's genuine interest in his thoughts and opinions felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. She asked about his daughter with real curiosity, about his chess background without condescension, about his current work with the respect accorded to honest labor honestly performed. Emma, for her part, had begun asking questions about Daddy's friend from work, the pretty lady who'd helped at the hospital, and who somehow made her father's face soften when he mentioned her. Children had an intuitive understanding of their parents' emotional weather, and Emma could sense the subtle shift in Liam's daily mood, the way he seemed lighter and more hopeful than he'd been since her mother's death. The 3 of them began spending time together outside the sterile confines of office buildings and medical facilities. Saturday afternoon trips to the park where Emma could play while the adults talked. Casual dinners at family restaurants, where Celeste marveled at the easy intimacy between father and daughter. Movie nights at Liam's modest apartment, where she learned to navigate the complex negotiations required to find films suitable for an 8-year-old's viewing. Celeste discovered that she genuinely enjoyed Emma's company, finding in the child's bright curiosity and unguarded affection something she'd forgotten she was missing. Emma, in turn, was fascinated by this glamorous woman who dressed like a princess but talked to her like an equal, who knew about boardrooms and business deals, but also remembered what it was like to be 8 years old and full of questions about the world. The growing closeness between them felt natural and inevitable, like the organic development of a chess position where every move flowed logically from the last. But their private happiness was about to collide with the public scrutiny that came with Celeste's prominence, setting in motion a series of events that would test the foundation of everything they were building together. The video appeared on the company's internal social media platform on a Tuesday morning, posted by Marcus Webb, a junior associate in the accounting department who'd been working late the previous week. The footage was grainy, shot through the glass wall of the conference room on his phone, but the audio was clear enough. Celeste's voice making her reckless offer, Liam's measured response, the intensity of their chess game compressed into 90 seconds of corporate drama. The caption read, "When the CEO promises to marry the janitor if he beats her at chess, and he actually does it in 3 moves, is this legally binding?" The post was tagged with laughing emojis and shared across departments with the viral enthusiasm that only workplace gossip could generate. By noon, the video had been viewed by half the company and forwarded to dozens of personal accounts. The comment thread grew like a malignant tumor, filled with speculation about Celeste's personal life, jokes about office romances, and increasingly pointed questions about whether company policy had been violated. The Human Resources Department fielded 17 calls before lunch, most of them requesting clarification about fraternization policies and executive conduct standards. Celeste first learned about the video when her assistant knocked on her office door with an expression that suggested incoming disaster. "Miss Hawthorne, we have a situation," Jennifer began carefully. "There's a video circulating on the company platform. It shows you playing chess with one of the maintenance staff. The content is generating discussion." The blood drained from Celeste's face as she watched the footage, seeing her moment of impulsive flirtation transformed into public spectacle. The comments were worse than the video itself, a toxic mixture of sexism and classism that reduced her to a caricature and dismissed Liam as a gold digger seeking to exploit her wealth and position. The professional persona she'd spent decades crafting was being dissected by people who knew nothing about her life or her choices. Her phone rang constantly throughout the afternoon, board members expressing concern about corporate image, business partners making carefully worded inquiries about her judgment, reporters from the business press hoping to transform workplace gossip into a story about executive impropriety. Each conversation chipped away at her composure, forcing her to defend decisions she wasn't sure she understood herself. The worst call came from Richard Hawthorne, her uncle and the chairman of the board, whose disapproval carried the weight of family disappointment and fiduciary responsibility. "Celeste, what the hell is this nonsense about marrying the janitor? The board is concerned about your judgment. This kind of publicity could damage our reputation with clients." "It was a joke." "Richard?" she said tightly, hating the defensive tone in her own voice. A casual comment taken out of context by someone with too much time and too little discretion. "It doesn't look casual in the video," he replied coldly. "It looks like you're making a mockery of your position and the company's dignity." That evening, she confronted Liam in the building's service elevator, her composure finally cracking under the accumulated weight of public humiliation and professional pressure. The man who'd seemed so noble and principled in the hospital now looked to her like a potential opportunist, someone who might have orchestrated the entire situation for personal gain. "Did you know?" she demanded without preamble. "Did you know that little weasel was recording us? Was this all some elaborate scheme to embarrass me or leverage yourself into a better situation?" Liam's face went carefully blank, the expression of someone who'd learned to weather accusations without fighting back. "No," he said simply. "I didn't know anyone was recording. I don't want anything from you except your friendship, which I'm apparently about to lose." "My friendship?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with the particular cruelty that came from lashing out at the person closest to the source of pain. "Is that what you call it when you humiliate someone in front of their entire company? When you make them look like a fool who can't even tell when they're being hustled?" "I never hustled you," Liam replied quietly. "I played chess, the same way I've played it for 20 years. You offered something you didn't mean, and I won a game you didn't expect to lose. That's not a con. It's just what happened." The reasonableness of his response only inflamed her anger further, making her feel petty and irrational in comparison to his calm dignity. Right. The noble janitor, who's too pure to take advantage of a situation. You must be laughing at all of us, the rich idiots, who never suspected that the help might have actual brains. Something flickered in Liam's eyes then, the first crack in his carefully maintained composure. You want to know what I'm laughing at? I'm laughing at myself for thinking you were different, for believing that someone who built an empire might understand what it means to sacrifice everything for the people you love. But you're just like the rest of them. Everything's a transaction. Everyone's got an angle, and God forbid anyone should exist outside the neat little boxes you've created for them. The elevator reached the ground floor and opened with a mechanical ding that sounded like a death knell. Liam stepped out without looking back, leaving Celeste alone with the echo of his words and the growing realization that she'd just destroyed the best thing that had happened to her in years. The next few days passed in a blur of damage control and corporate crisis management. The video was removed from the company platform, but had already been copied and shared across social media, taking on a life of its own beyond the confines of corporate gossip. Celeste threw herself into work with renewed intensity, staying late to avoid the sympathetic looks of her staff and the speculative whispers that followed her through the halls. She didn't see Liam again until the following Thursday, when Emma's asthma attacked with a viciousness that sent them racing back to the emergency room. The call came to her office at 2 in the afternoon, Liam's voice tight with controlled panic, asking if her insurance authorization was still valid, if she could help them navigate the system one more time. Celeste was in her car before he finished speaking, driving through downtown traffic with the single-minded focus of someone who'd finally identified what actually mattered. She found them in the pediatric ward, Emma hooked to oxygen and looking impossibly small in the hospital bed, Liam holding her hand and trying to read her a story while she struggled to breathe. The sight of his tears, silent, desperate, utterly unguarded, hit her like a physical blow. This was what real fear looked like. What genuine love demanded. What it meant to have someone else's life matter more than your own pride or professional reputation. Standing in that sterile room, watching a father's heart break over his daughter's labored breathing, Celeste finally understood the magnitude of her own selfishness. She stayed through the night, not because her presence was needed, but because leaving felt impossible. Emma's condition stabilized around dawn, the oxygen levels climbing back into safe territory, the color returning to her lips as the medications did their work. But the crisis had revealed something that couldn't be medicated away. The little girl was getting worse. Her episodes more frequent and severe, her tiny body losing the battle against a condition that no amount of love could cure. The doctor wants to discuss more aggressive treatment options, Liam said quietly, as they sat in the family lounge, both of them exhausted beyond the point of maintaining social pretenses. Experimental therapies, specialists in other cities. The kind of care that costs more than I make in 5 years. Celeste wanted to offer money, to write checks that would solve the immediate problem, but she could see in his face that charity would only drive him further away. Instead, she asked the harder question. What can I do? Nothing, he said, but without bitterness. This isn't a problem you can fix, Celeste. Some things just are what they are. The acceptance in his voice made her chest ache with unshed tears. She'd spent her entire adult life believing that every problem had a solution, that enough money or influence or strategic thinking could overcome any obstacle. But here was a man she cared about, facing a situation that couldn't be managed or negotiated or bought off. And her helplessness was complete. "I'm sorry," she said finally, the words carrying years of accumulated regret. "For what I said in the elevator. For assuming the worst about you. For being exactly the kind of person you thought I was." Liam looked at her with those gray-green eyes that saw too much. "You were scared," he said simply. "People say things they don't mean when they're scared. I understand that. Do you forgive me? There's nothing to forgive." You reacted the way anyone in your position would react. I just hoped you might be different." The quiet devastation in his voice was worse than anger would have been. A recognition that she'd failed to live up to some standard she hadn't even known existed. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain the pressures that had driven her to lash out. But all of those explanations felt like excuses in the face of his daughter's struggle to breathe. That afternoon, Celeste made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her professional reputation for calculated risk assessment. She drove to Liam's apartment complex, a modest collection of buildings that housed the working families who kept the city running, and knocked on his door with no plan beyond the need to try again. Emma answered, looking pale but alert, her breathing easier than it had been in the hospital. "Hi, Miss Celeste," she said with the shy smile that never failed to melt something in Celeste's chest. "Daddy's in the kitchen making grilled cheese. Do you want some?" The domestic normalcy of the scene, father cooking, daughter playing, the comfortable chaos of a life lived on love rather than profit margins, made Celeste's throat tight with emotion. This was what she'd been afraid of losing to corporate gossip and professional judgment. This small pocket of warmth in a world that had grown increasingly cold around her. Liam emerged from the kitchen with a questioning look, but Emma had already taken Celeste's hand and was leading her to the table where the chess set still sat in its place of honor. "Daddy taught me some moves," the little girl announced proudly. "Want to see?" What followed was the most important chess lesson of Celeste's life, though it had nothing to do with strategy or tactics. Emma played with the unself-conscious joy of someone for whom the game was pure pleasure, making moves that violated every principle of sound chess, but somehow captured the essence of what made the game beautiful. She narrated her thinking out loud, creating elaborate stories for the pieces, turning the ancient battle into a fairy tale where the pawns were brave peasants and the queen was a benevolent ruler who protected everyone. "You're not playing to win," Celeste observed. Not critically, but with genuine curiosity. "Winning's not the fun part," Emma replied seriously. "The fun part is all the things that happen before someone wins." The simple wisdom of the statement hit Celeste like a revelation. She'd spent so many years focused on outcomes, quarterly results, market share, competitive advantage, that she'd forgotten to notice the texture of the experience itself. Chess with Emma wasn't about demonstrating superiority or achieving victory. It was about connection, imagination, the shared pleasure of two minds meeting across 64 squares. When Liam joined them at the table an hour later, the three of them began a different kind of game entirely. They played team chess, with Emma advising both sides, creating positions that were tactically nonsensical but rich with narrative possibility. They invented new rules, made up stories about the pieces, turned the royal game into something playful and collaborative rather than competitive and zero-sum. "I brought something," Celeste said eventually, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. Inside was a chess set carved from beautiful maple and walnut, each piece a work of art that caught the afternoon light streaming through the apartment windows. "I thought Emma might like her own set." Emma's eyes went wide with delight as she lifted each piece, examining the intricate details with the reverence of someone who understood that she was holding something precious. "They're so beautiful," she whispered, tracing the carved mane of a knight with one small finger. "Are they really for me?" "They're really for you," Celeste confirmed, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the child's gratitude and everything to do with the simple joy of giving without expectation of return. "Your dad tells me you're getting pretty good at the game." Liam watched the exchange with an expression that cycled through surprise, appreciation, and something deeper that made Celeste's pulse quicken. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, but she could hear in his voice that he understood the gesture for what it was. Not charity, but an offering, a bridge across the chasm her words had created between them. "I wanted to," she replied, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the hospital. "I've been thinking about what you said, about sacrifice and what really matters. I think I've been playing the wrong game for a very long time." They talked as Emma explored her new chess set, arranging and rearranging the pieces in patterns that pleased her artistic sensibilities rather than any strategic logic. The conversation was tentative at first, both of them careful to avoid the landmines of their recent conflict, but gradually it found its natural rhythm. Liam spoke about his plans for Emma's care, the specialists he'd consulted, the delicate balance between hope and financial reality that governed their daily decisions. Celeste found herself opening up about the pressures of corporate leadership in ways she'd never done with anyone, the isolation that came with being responsible for hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars in shareholder value. She talked about the video and its aftermath, the way it had stripped away her carefully constructed professional image and forced her to confront who she really was beneath the executive armor. "The board is considering my position," she admitted, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "Richard thinks I've damaged the company's reputation." "Maybe he's right. Are you afraid of losing your job?" Liam asked, genuine concern in his voice. Celeste considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, the possibility would have terrified her, representing the collapse of everything she'd worked to build. But sitting in this modest apartment, watching Emma play with her chess set while her father worried about medical bills, she found that her priorities had shifted in ways she was only beginning to understand. "I'm afraid of losing this," she said quietly, gesturing to encompass the three of them, the warmth of the afternoon light, the comfortable domesticity that had somehow become more precious to her than any corporate achievement. The final scene unfolded 2 months later in the backyard of the house they'd bought together, a modest but comfortable place with enough room for Emma to play, and a garden where Celeste was learning to grow things other than profit margins. The chess set sat on the patio table between them, the pieces catching the golden light of a Sunday afternoon as they played their weekly game. It had become a ritual, these Sunday matches, less about competition than about the simple pleasure of spending time together, of watching Emma read in the afternoon sun, while they moved pieces across the familiar battlefield of 64 squares. The transformation in all their lives had been gradual but profound, marked not by dramatic gestures but by the accumulation of small moments like this one. "Your move," Liam said, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world. His face had lost the haunted quality that had marked it during Emma's worst episodes, replaced by something that looked almost like contentment. The new medications were working. The specialists Celeste's connections had recommended were optimistic about Emma's long-term prognosis, and for the first time in years, he could imagine a future that extended beyond the next medical crisis. Celeste studied the board, not calculating 3 moves ahead but simply enjoying the moment. The warm pressure of Emma's head against her shoulder, as the little girl read quietly in her lap. The position was complex but not critical, the kind of game where the pleasure lay in the playing rather than the winning. She'd learned to appreciate these drawn-out, meandering matches that could last for hours, punctuated by conversation and laughter, and the occasional interruption from Emma, who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. "If I make this move," she said, indicating a knight that would fork his king and queen in a combination she'd been setting up for the last 10 moves, "and you respond the way I think you will, I might actually beat you for once." It was a running joke between them, her perpetual quest to defeat the man who'd checkmated her in 3 moves on their first encounter. She'd come close a few times, had even managed to secure a few draws, but Liam's chess intuition remained as sharp as ever, honed by years of high-level competition that muscle memory couldn't forget. "Might," Liam agreed with a smile that made her heart skip the way it had on that first evening, when he'd looked up from the reset board, and she'd seen past his coveralls to the brilliant mind beneath. "Or I might surprise you. I've been known to do that." Emma looked up from her book with the serious expression she wore when dispensing important wisdom, a look that never failed to remind Celeste of her father's intensity tempered by her own natural optimism. "Maybe you could both win," she suggested. a sentiment that had become something of a family motto. Maybe winning isn't about the chess game at all. Celeste and Liam exchanged glances across the board, both understanding that their daughter, because that's what Emma had become, officially and emotionally, had once again identified the essential truth that adults sometimes missed in their focus on competition and achievement. The game they were really playing had nothing to do with 64 squares and everything to do with building a life worth living, piece by careful piece, move by thoughtful move. "You know what?" Celeste said, reaching across the table to take Liam's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had carried them all through the difficult months of adjustment and healing. "I think she's right. I think we both already won." The chess pieces sat forgotten as the three of them dissolved into laughter, the sound carrying across their small backyard like a promise of all the games yet to be played, all the victories yet to be shared, all the love yet to be discovered in the simple act of choosing each other, one move at a time. The afternoon light filtered through the maple tree they'd planted together last spring, casting dappled shadows across the board where their unfinished game waited patiently for their return. But for now, the real game, the one that mattered most, was already won, played out not in the movement of carved pieces across a checkered battlefield, but in the quiet moments of ordinary happiness that had become the true measure of their success.